Chapter 1: The Arrival. There are journeys, my friend, that begin with more than a simple ticket and destination. Journeys that carry with them a whisper of history, a shadow of decisions once made, of secrets not yet spoken aloud, and occasionally a presence one cannot quite explain. And so it was on a particularly still afternoon, without storm or spectacle, that the famed Orient Express prepared to pull away from the Gare de Lyon, its polished compartments quietly gleaming beneath a sky that could neither commit to gloom nor light. Among its roster of passengers, an orchestra conductor of some small European renown, a retired barrister with a fondness for Turkish cigarettes, and a scattering of affluent travelers in furs and wool. The last aboard was a woman who bore nothing overtly unusual. That precisely was her intrigue. She walked with a grace that had not yet abandoned her despite the strain of age, perhaps somewhere in her late 50s or early 60s, dignified, though not fragile. Her coat was brown. Her gloves were gray. Her eyes, well, it was difficult to say. Some said blue, others gray, the kind of eyes one remembered for their silence rather than their shade. And she carried no luggage larger than a worn leather case and a simple cloth bag, the latter containing, as would later be noted, a sketchbook. She gave her name without hesitation, though without warmth, Mrs. Lestrange. Now, for most, that would suffice. A boarding pass is not a biography, but it was Miss Marple who noticed more than the train schedule or the velvet of its curtains. In the woman's smile, there was a trace of something unspoken, not melancholy, not regret, but a restraint, as though she had rehearsed civility to the point of exhaustion. She spoke politely. She responded when addressed, but she never initiated. Not once. She chose compartment 7, second class, though she could easily have afforded more. She declined champagne. She declined the porter's assistance. But she accepted, without any protest, the seat across from Miss Marple, and when the train steward passed by with a tray of cards, she took one without glancing at the game. It was a queen of spades. She folded it once and slid it into her sketchbook. Ah, yes, the sketchbook. Now, that became something of a curiosity. Mrs. Lestrange would not sketch openly, but at moments when she believed herself unseen or forgotten, she would flip open the battered book and draw. Not landscapes, not objects, but people. The other passengers, rendered in charcoal, delicately, almost reverently, each accompanied by a date in the corner, as if time mattered to the faces she recorded. And she watched them, yes, with a quiet intensity, before she put the pencil away and folded her hands like a woman in prayer. Miss Marple had seen this kind of observation before, though never with such careful concealment. It was not curiosity. It was purpose. And what purpose could a middle-aged woman with no companion and no backstory have aboard a train of strangers, recording their faces as if they were moments? It would be easy to dismiss such details as quirks. One might label her recluse or eccentric, but those terms often serve as polite placeholders for stories we would rather not hear. There was Miss Marple sensed something unresolved here, a motive, a confession perhaps waiting for its cue. And so she watched her, quietly, patiently, without judgment. The passengers settled. The whistle blew, and as the train shuddered once, then again, before easing forward like a creature waking from hibernation, Mrs. Lestrange turned her head and said the only words she would speak for the next several hours. Sometimes journeys are about more than where one arrives. Sometimes it's about who is still left when they do. She did not smile when she said it. She did not blink. And Miss Marple, though hardly given to dramatics, felt something shift, like a forgotten name rising to the surface of memory. This was not simply a passenger. This was a woman whose presence changed the temperature of the air, if not the direction of the journey. And as the platform disappeared behind them, and the train carried its collection of secrets forward into evening, a thought settled, uninvited, into the back of the mind. She introduced herself only as Mrs. Lestrange, and by the next night she would vanish without a trace. Before we continue, if you find yourself drawn into these shadows, this quiet suspense, and the elegant danger of Miss Marple's world, I encourage you, quietly, respectfully, to subscribe. It helps keep the mystery alive. Now then, shall we continue? The train had long since departed Paris when the silence between the compartments settled into something quieter than comfort. It was a silence not born of rest or fatigue, but of observation. Each traveler, it seemed, was watching someone, whether intentionally or by habit. The rhythm of the Orient Express, steady and precise, provided a kind of theatrical stage upon which small human dramas could unfold without the noise of interruption. Miss Marple, a woman no longer surprised by the facades people wore, watched without appearing to. That was her gift, and in her quiet assessment, Mrs. Lestrange remained the most unreadable page in the compartment. By now, hours had passed. The dinner car had filled and emptied, its tables bearing the remnants of conversation, wine, and the usual polite disputes about French sauces and timetables. And yet Mrs. Lestrange had eaten alone, at the far end of the carriage, next to the window, without touching her glass of red Bordeaux, which caught the low light like a telegram waiting to be opened. She had chosen the roasted duck, declined dessert, and returned to her compartment in a manner that gave no impression at all, neither swift nor slow, neither formal nor casual. In fact, there was something about her walk that reminded one of a nurse from an earlier age, the kind who moved with quiet authority, invisible until needed. It was some time after 10, with the train approaching the Alps, that Miss Marple noticed something unusual. The corridor, which had emptied for the night, should have been still. Yet, as she passed on her way to fetch a cup of tea, an indulgence the staff allowed her due to her reputation and bearing, she caught a movement at the corner of her eye. The door to compartment 7, Mrs. Lestrange's cabin, was ajar. Now, ajar is a word that does not belong on the Orient Express. Precision is expected, order is observed, and doors are either open or shut. This one, however, remained suspended, inviting neither entry nor dismissal. Within, a dim light revealed no sign of the woman herself. The bed was untouched, the blanket perfectly creased, but the sketchbook lay open on the small table, and even from the corridor, Miss Marple could see the lines of charcoal. Faces, so many faces, and just near the center, her own. Her likeness, rendered in fine detail, her eyes shadowed slightly, giving the effect of weariness or warning. And beneath her image, in the unmistakable handwriting of someone accustomed to cataloguing, a single word: observer. Miss Marple did not step inside. That would have been inappropriate, and in any case unnecessary. The message was clear. Mrs. Lestrange saw more than she allowed others to know, and perhaps she wished Miss Marple to know that she knew. Returning to her own compartment, Miss Marple thought back, not hours, but decades. The name Lestrange had appeared before, not often. Once, perhaps in connection with a certain inquiry. A home in Devonshire, a woman accused of administering something questionable to patients who never quite recovered. It had been passed over, quietly resolved. There had been a fire, as she recalled, some telegrams lost, and no formal charges filed. But the name had stayed in a drawer in Miss Marple's memory, and now, like a forgotten diary retrieved from a locked trunk, it opened itself again. At precisely 11:08, the train's lights dimmed and returned. Just a flicker, perhaps electrical, perhaps the cold, but it was enough to shift something intangible, one of those moments that could be dismissed but rarely is. It was then that the first sound was heard, not loud, not chaotic, but sharp and unmistakable, a voice, high and breathless, from further down the corridor. One word, perhaps a name, and then nothing. The sort of sound that demands attention precisely because it does not continue. A sound that should be explained, but isn't. Staff were summoned. Checks were made. No one was missing. All doors accounted for, except one, Mrs. Lestrange's. Her bed remained untouched, her bag still in place, her coat neatly hung. But of the woman herself there was no trace, and more curiously, no witness to her exit. No porter recalled opening the door. No passenger saw her leave the dining car, and the steward who had passed her last recalled only this, that she had asked for a pot of water and 2 empty cups. 2, but she had been alone, and now she was not anywhere at all. The compartment was searched. The train, while moving, was limited in possibility. A locked room, one might say, without the locks. A corridor of suspects without a crime. A presence without a disappearance. Or perhaps the other way around. And the sketchbook? Closed now, but with a thin corner of paper torn. Removed deliberately. One face missing. Miss Marple, seated again in her berth, sipped her tea slowly. Her expression unchanged. But her thoughts were traveling faster than the train. There are moments in life that are too precise to be coincidental. And there are passengers who do not board trains for travel, but for reckoning. This, Miss Marple now understood, was not an ordinary journey. And Mrs. Lestrange, whatever her name truly meant, had not simply boarded the train. She had selected it. When the morning came, it was not welcomed with fanfare, nor even the mundane murmur of a train easing into the daylight. No, it arrived cautiously, soft, indifferent, and somewhat disinterested in the concerns of those aboard. The Orient Express cut its way through a narrow passage of the Jura Mountains, the snow pressing in against its silver flank like an accusation. Mrs. Lestrange had not returned, and yet, curiously, no one seemed quite prepared to name her absence. There had been inquiries, yes. A steward had knocked twice on compartment 7 before assuming she had disembarked overnight, perhaps at Bellegarde. This was, of course, impossible. No passenger may leave mid-transit, not in a storm, and certainly not without documentation. Still, no alarm was raised. No one filed a report. Her belongings remained untouched. All but one. Miss Marple, having requested a private moment with the train's conductor, an understanding young man from Liège, received permission to step inside the woman's compartment. The bed had still not been used, not even sat upon. The window, however, was ajar. Now this in itself was curious. For those unfamiliar with the Orient Express, it must be understood. The windows do not open easily. They are designed to insulate, to preserve the equilibrium of the cabin. And yet here it was, open by 2 inches, just enough to allow a whisper of frozen air, a whisper that did not belong. There was something else, tucked delicately into the frame of the vanity mirror, perhaps placed there in haste, or perhaps with deliberate precision, was a calling card. No name, no title, only a smudged fingerprint on one side and on the other, a phrase written in pencil, almost too faint to read. For those who remember, for those who waited. Miss Marple held the card between her gloved fingers, turning it once, then again. There was nothing on the surface that offered a clue, but she knew the value of silence, and she knew the difference between ordinary paper and deliberate message. As she turned to leave, her eyes were drawn once more to the sketchbook. It had been moved, only slightly, but moved, the spine now angled toward the edge of the table. She opened it slowly. Every page remained, every sketched face, every smudge of graphite, except the final one, where before there had been an image torn clean. Now there remained only a faint imprint, the ghost of pressure from pencil on paper, just barely visible beneath the right light. The face was missing, but a shape was still there. It was a man, tall, thin-necked, hollow eyes, unfamiliar. Below it, in tiny cursive, hardly more than a breath, was a single word, passenger. She turned the page. The back of the sketch, in similar handwriting. He knows what was done, and what was owed. Miss Marple closed the book, slowly, respectfully. She did not speak aloud, but in her mind, one word repeated with unwelcome certainty. Revenge. For what, she could not yet say. But this was not an accident, and it was not fantasy. This was a reckoning wearing the clothes of travel. As she returned to her compartment, she passed the older gentleman in the navy wool coat. Mr. Dupin, he called himself. He had spoken little since boarding, content to read a diary bound in green leather. Yet now he glanced up, met her gaze, and said quietly, with neither question nor context, "She was never meant to reach Istanbul." Miss Marple paused, measured him, and chose not to reply. That night the train continued east. The dining car was quiet, the wine flowed less freely, and the quiet between passengers had changed. It was no longer casual. It was weighted, and then, precisely at 1:14 a.m., as snow began to fall against the long windows of the sleeping cars, a sound cut through the carriage. A woman's voice, one note only, sharp, brief, as though yanked from a throat by surprise. A steward rushed to respond. Compartment 7 was still empty. Doors were knocked. No one was missing. No one confessed to hearing. But Miss Marple knew better. In the quiet that followed, she sat upright, eyes open in the dark, listening, and then, faintly, unmistakably, barely more than a breath, footsteps, in the corridor, moving toward her door, then nothing. Silence returned. And it was this silence that she feared most, not for what it contained, but for what it allowed to pass unnoticed. She had boarded the train as Mrs. Lestrange. She had spoken few words, left fewer belongings. She had vanished without a trace, and yet something remained, something that hadn't left. If you've felt the weight of the mystery, the subtle change in air, the footsteps not seen, then stay with us. Subscribe quietly, respectfully, and prepare for what follows next, because this journey is far from over. Chapter 2, The Incident. There are silences that beg to be broken, and there are silences that warn you not to speak. This silence that settled over the corridor of the sleeping car following those uncertain footsteps, belonged unmistakably to the latter. Miss Marple, though not given to dramatics, remained still for a time longer than most would consider natural, her posture neither rigid nor at ease. She had not dreamed the sound. Of that she was sure. The footsteps had presence, weight, rhythm. And yet no door had opened. No shadow had passed the narrow slit of her compartment's curtained window. No figure had moved down the hall. Only silence remained, like a closed book containing pages no one dared revisit. Morning returned with that peculiar gray light only known to long train journeys. Too dim to be day, too persistent to be night. Breakfast was served with polite murmurs, the staff efficient, unconcerned. If there was discomfort in the air, it was noticed only by those attuned to such things, and Miss Marple, of course, noticed it immediately. It was not the absence of Mrs. Lestrange that stirred concern, not yet. It was the refusal of anyone to name it. Her seat in the dining car remained untouched, her name unspoken, yet glances drifted often toward the empty space, not boldly, but in increments, as if those who dared look too long might be called upon to explain something they could not. But it was the conductor, young, sincere, and poorly suited for deceit, who first mentioned it aloud. One of the passengers, Madam, he began, his accent hesitant, reported a most curious detail during the night. Miss Marple, sipping her tea with measured restraint, merely inclined her head. He says he saw the English lady standing in the corridor mirror. Now, this in itself would have caused no alarm, save for the phrasing. She was in the mirror, not before it. The distinction, though subtle, held weight. She appeared to be speaking to someone, the conductor continued, his brow furrowed, but no one else was there. And then, just as the snow began to tighten its hold upon the tracks outside, the train slowed again, then stopped. It was not scheduled. There had been no announcement. And when the lights overhead flickered once, then held, then flickered again, the passengers no longer dismissed coincidence. Miss Marple rose, not hurriedly, but with intention, and returned to her compartment. It was then she saw it. On the velvet bench, where Mrs. Lestrange had spent her final hours on board, if final they were at all, lay the sketchbook, open, abandoned. The angle of the spine suggested haste. The page curled slightly as though stirred by air that had not passed through in hours. She did not touch it at first. Instead, she observed, there, drawn in tight, deliberate strokes, were the faces of the passengers. Familiar, recognizable, likenesses rendered with startling clarity. The conductor, the gentleman in the navy coat, the American couple with the habit of finishing each other's sentences, even Miss Marple herself, chin tilted, eyes lowered. All were there, all but one. One face erased. No, not erased. Scratched. So violently that the paper tore in two places, the lines of destruction forming a brutal X over where eyes once were. The charcoal had left a dusting across the page, like ash. It was not the absence of a face that unsettled her. It was the rage embedded in the act of removal. This was no omission. This was a reaction, a violent reaction. She looked again. The outline of the figure remained, barely, a shadow. The height, perhaps taller than most. The shoulders narrow, but the identity gone. Someone had been made unwelcome in the pages of that book, deliberately erased as though to say, "You are no longer part of this." And it was then that Miss Marple's I caught the edge of something else. A folded corner. No, not quite folded, creased, gently, as though hidden in plain view. She turned the page. At first she said nothing. The next image, unfinished yet unmistakable, was of her. Miss Marple, reclining, eyes closed, at rest, drawn from life, not imagination. She had not posed for it. She had not known it had been taken. And behind her figure, barely etched but present, unmistakably present, was another, a man, standing, too close, his eyes not drawn, his expression left blank. Only a single detail had been added, a hand, outstretched, reaching just above her shoulder. There are moments in the human experience when the mind wishes to look away, not from fear, but from the gentle cruelty of recognition. Miss Marple did not close the sketchbook. Not yet. Her eyes remained fixed on the image, the curve of her sleeping form so meticulously rendered, the folds of her blouse, the careful slope of her hat set beside her. Details too exact have come from recollection alone. The presence behind her, though faceless, was real, not in the sense of confirmation, but in the way truth tends to announce itself without permission. He was there, whoever he was, and she had not known. But she had felt something, hadn't she? That first evening, when silence had hovered too heavily, when she had stirred not from sound but from presence. She turned the page again. It had been used before, pressed faintly into the grain of the next sheet, as if reused in haste, were shapes, incomplete, but among them an unmistakable word, etched so faintly it might have been mistaken for a stain had her eye not been trained to seek the unspoken. Alibi, written once, then crossed through, and beneath it, almost like a correction, another word. Confession. Miss Marple looked up. The compartment was still. The snow outside pressed against the windows, muting the train's view into a shifting landscape of white. They would not be moving again soon. There had been no announcement of delay, but the truth was written plainly on the passengers' faces, restless, half-occupied, performing the theater of patience. Some read, some wandered, others pretended not to notice the passage of time at all. She rose, steady and without drama, and stepped into the corridor. At the end of the hall, seated near the junction between carriages, was the man in the navy coat, Mr. Dupin. He looked up as she passed. This time he did not speak, only nodded, a courteous gesture, respectful, measured. She continued forward, entering the small parlor compartment. Here, the staff had left a pot of lukewarm tea, some papers, and 2 backgammon boards no one had touched. It was then that she found it, not by accident but by intuition. There, between the pages of a folded French newspaper, lay a telegram, not addressed, not dated, not official, typed, single sheet, 3 lines. 7 were present. 1 has vanished. The 8th watches. No sender, no addressee, just a message placed intentionally and carelessly disguised as discarded newsprint. It was not meant for just anyone. It was meant for someone who knew where to look. Miss Marple folded it slowly and slipped it into her sleeve. Then, just as she turned to leave, she heard it again. That voice, not from memory this time, but clearly from the hallway. Low, female, 1 word only. Don't. She froze, not in fear but in focus. The voice had come from the mirror. Yes, the full-length pane of silvered glass that lined the carriage end. Common on this train, always overlooked. But just now, just in that moment, the reflection did not align. She saw herself, but not alone. A figure moved just beyond her shoulder in the reflection, but not in the room. She turned. No one. She turned back. Nothing now. Only her face, returned to symmetry, with a trace of something behind the eyes. A doubt, perhaps, or a memory pressing for release. She returned to her compartment, the sketchbook now closed, the seat empty, but her teacup had been moved. 1/2 an inch. No more. That was the kind of detail most would miss. She did not. The train did not move again that day. A polite announcement, relayed in French, German, and English, stated only that snow had made further passage temporarily impossible. No exact timetable was offered. No alternative suggested. It was simply still. The passengers adapted with varying degrees of grace. The American woman requested extra coffee. The conductor attempted conversation, his nerves betrayed only by the trembling of his left thumb. And the man in the navy coat, Mr. Dupin, remained precisely as he had been, as though fixed in time. One could have walked past him thrice in an hour and never found him changed. Miss Marple, however, was not idle. She requested access to the luggage compartment. Her reasons, when asked, were modest. She had misplaced a scarf, she claimed. Cream, with a small embroidered rose. The conductor, not wanting trouble, obliged. Below, the cold was deeper, the lamps dimmer, and the cases, rows upon rows, rested like old secrets, labeled and stacked with military care. It was here she located the valise belonging to Mrs. Lestrange. Brown leather, brass buckles, a small initial pressed into the handle's base, yell. But it was the tag that held her gaze. It was still attached. Edith Lestrange, Devonshire. No forwarding address. No forwarding address. On a cross-border journey. Curious. She opened it gently. Inside, neatly folded, 2 cardigans, a book on post-war palliative care, a half-used bottle of lavender cologne. Nothing unexpected, nothing damning, until she found the folder. Thin, plain, bound with red string. Inside, clippings, articles from English newspapers, dated from as far back as 1939. Headlines once ignored, now pressed together in quiet alignment. One noted the closure of a convalescent home after allegations of misconduct. Another spoke of a confession extracted under duress, then withdrawn. A third, the oldest, had been circled in pencil. Inquiry dropped in sudden fire at Devonshire facility. Nurse presumed lost. No body recovered. She paused. Presumed lost. Not confirmed. Presumed. She turned the page. A name had been underlined 3 times in blue ink, Bantry. The same Bantry who, some years earlier, had hosted Miss Marple during the unfortunate business of the body in the library. A name long buried in the ledger of half-forgotten inquiries. But that case had been resolved, hadn't it? The final clipping was dated only months before the current journey. An obituary. The name printed was incorrect, but the photograph was not. It was Mrs. Lestrange. The caption read, Elizabeth Warren, 62, passed quietly at home. No next of kin. So, Who then was aboard the train? Miss Marple returned above. The air had changed. The passengers wore their fatigue thinly, like coats outgrown. Conversation came in mutters. The snow pressed harder. And in the dining car the steward lit candles, not out of necessity, but out of instinct, as though brightness might ward off something uninvited. She passed the lounge, where the American couple sat with their crossword. Only one word had been filled in: facade. She moved to the observation car. Empty. Except the sketchbook. It had returned, placed precisely where she had left it the night before. Only now a new page had been added, rougher than the others, less careful, drawn in haste, but the subject clear. Miss Marple, eyes open, and behind her the figure again, still without face, but no longer featureless. This time a single mark had been added, a handkerchief in his pocket, monogrammed. She closed the book, slowly, her breath shallow. DL. There was no passenger by that name, but there had been, once, during that case in Devonshire. He had testified, then disappeared, lost in the confusion following the fire. Another name never accounted for, another vanished thread. And suddenly, this journey felt less like a voyage forward, and more like a return. Miss Marple stared into the snow-blurred horizon beyond the carriage glass. "You can't vanish from a train sealed by snow," she whispered to herself, "unless you were never really here." And with that the question sharpens, not where Mrs. Lestrange has gone, but why she ever came at all. Chapter 3. The Descent. There is a point, rarely marked and often dismissed, when certainty begins to shift, not with a jolt, but with a hesitation. The world does not crack, it leans, ever so slightly, and when it does, nothing seems out of place, until it suddenly is. Miss Marple awoke, not with a start, but with the distinct awareness that something was missing. Not in the compartment. Her belongings were untouched, the sketchbook precisely where she had left it. No, it was the train itself. Its sound, the rhythm. The Orient Express, famed for its precision, no longer hummed with its subtle music of motion. It had stopped. Or had it? She stood and opened her curtain. Snow as far as the eye could stretch. Trees bowed under its weight, stillness pressing inward. But then, as her eyes adjusted, something flickered, not in the landscape, but in the window's reflection. For the briefest moment, she saw it, the face of Mrs. Lestrange, her eyes fixed, unblinking, then gone. She turned at once. Empty compartment. She had seen her, just for a moment, and yet, how could she be seen, reflected in the glass, if she was no longer aboard? Unless she had never left. By late morning, the atmosphere on the train had altered in ways words could not fully explain. The American woman, so composed the day before, now muttered under her breath as she folded and unfolded the same page of a crossword, her husband silent beside her, staring into his untouched tea. A Hungarian gentleman, who had spoken fluently at dinner the night prior, now struggled to recall basic French. The man in the navy coat, Mr. Dupin, still sat near the rear of the parlor car, but when Miss Marple greeted him softly, he blinked as if waking from sleep, unsure whether they had spoken before. Confusion, fatigue, a shared irritability that had begun to thicken like fog. The conductor, a young man with fair hair, Gerard, she believed his name had been, was last seen delivering breakfast trays, then vanished. A different steward, older, with a waxed mustache, now walked the corridor. When Miss Marple inquired after Gerard, the man paused, then gave a small shake of the head. "No Gerard on this train, madam. He brought me tea yesterday morning. You must be mistaken." She was not mistaken. He had carried a tray with mismatched cups. His shoes were one size too large. He wore a pin on his lapel in the shape of a small tulip. She checked the manifest. It had been conveniently moved. There was no record of a Gerard, no junior conductor, no apprentice steward, no tulip, but the sketchbook Yes, the sketchbook remained. She turned to the margins of a page near the center, between two partially drawn portraits. There, faintly penciled in what looked like the hurried hand of someone trying not to be noticed, Gerard, followed by the word, "Forgotten." The page had been smudged, as though someone had tried to erase the name, but not well enough. It was still there, still whispering. Outside, snow continued to press against the windows, but the light no longer tracked properly. Hours passed, yet the shadows did not shift. One passenger remarked that they'd been traveling west all morning. Another swore they were still in the Alps. A third insisted they had passed into Hungary hours ago. The maps did not match, nor did the clocks, and it was then that Miss Marple noticed the hallway. It was shorter than before. She counted the compartments. One was missing. Compartment 7, the one belonging to Mrs. Lestrange, was no longer between 6 and 8. She walked the corridor twice, then a third time, and finally at the end of the car she paused and waited. There, a sound. Footsteps. Not hers. Measured. Slow. Not approaching, not retreating. Only circling. There are patterns the mind depends upon. Hallways with proper length, clocks with proper rhythm, strangers behaving like strangers. When these are disrupted, even slightly, the world is not undone, merely rearranged. And for those who observe keenly, as Miss Marple had always done, that rearrangement becomes not a threat, but a clue. The footsteps ceased. Miss Marple stood alone at the far end of the corridor, listening to the hum of silence that returned, heavy now with implication. She opened the nearest door. Compartment 6, the American couple. They looked up with startled eyes, as though surprised to find themselves being watched, or perhaps surprised to still be there at all. "Did you hear anything?" she asked gently. They looked at one another, their hesitation brief but telling. "We thought it was the train shifting." "Yes," added the wife quickly. "We haven't moved in hours. But the walls, have they always been this close?" Miss Marple did not answer. Instead, she turned the corner, crossed through the dining car, and returned to her compartment. The sketchbook waited. It had not been touched, but its contents had changed. There, across 3 consecutive pages, were portraits of the same man, each slightly altered, his posture more slumped, his expression progressively confused. He was unfamiliar to her. Tall, with deep-set eyes, dark hair thinning at the temples, and a prominent scar on his cheek. She turned the final page and found a new line, handwritten with a rushed and uneven hand. Alibi constructed. Memory altered. Suspect misplaced. There was no signature, no name, and yet it was clear. Someone aboard the train was not who they claimed to be, perhaps not even who they believed themselves to be. She glanced out the window. Snow, but now something else. The faintest movement in the reflection again, this time more distinct. Mrs. Lestrange, watching from behind the glass. No expression, no breath, only eyes, and once more gone. A knock came at the door. She opened it. No one, but a folded note had been slid beneath. On plain paper in block capitals, "You are not the only one who remembers." Nothing more. No initials. No location. Miss Marple now understood the danger of clarity. It was not in what one saw. It was in what others insisted had never been there. She walked the train again, testing doors, studying faces. Mr. Dupin no longer sat in his usual place. The American couple now argued softly in German, unaware of it. The Hungarian gentleman had retreated entirely, his luggage packed, though the train had not moved. She stopped before the window of the last car, and there, reflected again in that distorting glass, she saw something she had not expected. Herself, not as she was now, but younger, much younger, sitting in a nursing chair, writing. The pen in her hand moved quickly. On the page, a name, Edith Lestrange. Then it shifted. The vision melted. returned. Only her reflection remained. And then, just for a moment, faintly, someone else stepped into view behind her. Not into the room. Into the reflection. Again faceless, but unmistakably present. And this time they whispered, "We never left the train." There is a particular cruelty in remembering what one is told never happened. Not by argument, but by absence, when the evidence is erased and the silence itself becomes the most persuasive denial. Miss Marple now understood. She was no longer merely observing confusion aboard the train. She was within it. The sketchbook had moved again. She was certain she had left it near the window. It now rested on her pillow, open to a page that had not existed the day before. This was no longer simply a collection of drawn faces. It had become a record, not of the journey itself, but of perception. Who saw? Who forgot? Who changed? On this page, the drawings were different, less careful, as if the hand that drew them no longer trusted what it saw. Symbols had replaced likenesses: an empty chair, a burning clock, a corridor without end. And at the center, written in bold graphite, a phrase underlined twice: "We are not who we boarded as." Miss Marple traced the letters with her finger, feeling each impression pressed deep into the paper. It was not metaphor. It was declaration. Passengers had begun to vanish, not in the dramatic sense, not with exclamations or commotion, but with a slow, quiet shift into absence. Where once they were seen, now they were not, and no one remembered them. The names were gone from the list. The conductor claimed only 11 guests had boarded at Paris, but Miss Marple remembered 13. She could count them clearly: their seats, their voices, their shoes left outside the compartments. The train, too, had changed. A door that once led to the luggage car now opened into a lavatory. The lavatory at the rear no longer opened at all. She knocked. There was no answer. Yet from within, she thought she heard the faint echo of something. Pages turning. Or was it whispering? In the dining car, the tablecloths had been replaced, but not by the staff. When asked, they denied any knowledge of the change. The new cloths were older, yellowed with age. On one, embroidered in thread that had begun to unravel, were the initials: Yell, Edith Lestrange. Again, always again. And in that moment a thought occurred, sharp, uninvited, and entirely unprovable. What if the train had not moved forward through time at all? What if they had moved backward, back not to a place, but to a memory? A locked room, yes, but not physical. A shared moment of betrayal, perhaps, or revenge. A confession left unspoken too long. And if so, what was hers? Miss Marple returned to her compartment, her expression unreadable now even to herself. She closed the door. Saturday. Breathed. Then opened the sketchbook again, one last time that night. Tucked within its final page, where the binding had begun to split, was a single slip of aged paper, folded once, twice, as if by habit. She unfolded it carefully. Not a drawing. A list. 6 names, each one crossed out, then a 7th her own. Not yet crossed. Just beneath it, in faint red pencil: Final hour approaches. She placed the paper down, and looked once more toward the window. The face was no longer there, but the space where it had been felt filled. By morning, more passengers would forget what day it was. The train's clock would reset, and Miss Marple would ask the only question still worth asking: if we are not who we boarded as, who, then, are we becoming? Chapter 4. The Investigation. There are questions one does not ask aloud, not for fear of the answer, but for fear that no answer exists at all. And yet, the absence of logic is where true investigation begins. For logic, as Miss Marple well knew, is simply a series of clues strung together in a manner we find acceptable. But what of the unacceptable? The contradictions? The moments where memory fails not because it forgets, but because it is deliberately rewritten? It was with this question quietly pacing her mind that Miss Marple began to speak again to the passengers, no longer as a fellow traveler, but as a quiet collector of truths. She began, quite simply, with the American couple. They were seated in the dining car, eyes forward, hands resting side by side without touching. A breakfast tray sat between them, untouched save for the butter, which had melted slowly into the linen cloth. "Forgive the interruption," Miss Marple said gently, "but may I ask, where did you say you boarded?" The husband smiled, but only faintly. He looked to his wife. "Zurich," she answered. "Ah," Miss Marple nodded. "But yesterday you mentioned Paris." The wife paused, blinked. Her face twitched, as if reconciling one truth with another. "Zurich, yes. Paris was— No, I don't believe I said that." Her husband nodded. "Zurich." Their forks remained untouched, the napkins still folded. Miss Marple thanked them and moved on. She stopped next at Mr. Dupin, the man in the navy coat who had, at the beginning, spoken with such quiet certainty. Today his complexion had turned sallow, his breath uneven. The green-bound diary he once clutched lay face down beside him. "Have you written anything new?" she asked softly. "I don't write," he replied without looking up. "Never have." "But your diary—" He stared at it, confused, then smiled. "Oh, yes. That— Not mine. I'm holding it for someone else." "Who?" "I don't recall." He began turning the pages aimlessly, then stopped. The page he paused on held a short paragraph, handwritten in ink that had bled slightly through the paper. "Devonshire Convalescent. Fire began in the west wing. 6 presumed lost. 1 unaccounted." Miss Marple said nothing. She left him there. By mid-morning the snow had faded slightly, but the sky remained without depth, white on white, indistinguishable horizon. The train had not moved, and yet no one spoke of disembarking. The Hungarian gentleman had not been seen since the day prior. When Miss Marple inquired with the steward, she was told, politely, almost apologetically, that no such man had boarded. She pressed. "He dined at my table. We spoke of Budapest. He wore a silver pin." "Madam," the steward replied, "I have served each passenger. I assure you, you are mistaken." Miss Marple returned to her compartment. The sketchbook sat closed. She opened it. New drawings, unmistakably added while she was away. The American couple, this time both with blank eyes. Mr. Dupin, still, but aged suddenly, hair thinner, shoulders hunched. And in the lower margin, faintly like an afterthought, all were there, once. The most dangerous answers are often those that appear too easily, tidy, agreeable, satisfying. Miss Marple, however, had never sought satisfaction. She sought alignment, and when the words people said did not align with the world around them, she knew where to press. By early afternoon, the train's stillness had become a kind of pressure. An unmoving carriage is no longer transportation, but confinement. The windows offered no variation. The trees outside had ceased to shift. And though the staff smiled, served, and polished silverware, they too had begun to repeat themselves. One steward, when asked for tea, replied, "Of course, madam," 3 times, each with identical tone as if rehearsed. And when he returned, it was not tea at all, but a glass of water tinted faintly with lavender. Miss Marple returned to her seat. She took out her notebook. She did not sketch. She listed each passenger, their claimed departure point, their conversations, discrepancies, dates. One pattern began to form, not in their present, but in their past. She began with Mr. Dupin, his vocabulary, his references to wartime protocols, the way he'd once mentioned ration slips, the style of his overcoat, older than it should be. Miss Marple had seen that type before, issued in the final winter of the war. It had an inner pocket for morphine ampoules. The American couple had, on their first evening, spoken of the sanatorium where we met. They had said it too quickly, then too quietly, a shared moment neither wished to revisit, and both pretended had never occurred. And then the steward, Gerard, who had vanished mid-shift. A name written in the sketchbook. Not a real name, perhaps, but the name of someone remembered wrongly, or remembered deliberately, and always forgotten soon after. The clue came not from conversation, but from absence. None of the passengers ever spoke of anything after the war, as if they hadn't lived beyond it. She rose, moved through the corridor, and entered the conductor's station. It was small, stacked with manifests, checklists, keyrings. She examined the clipboard. Boarding records were sparse. Too sparse. Some of the names were typed. Some were handwritten. A few were smudged. And one entry had been crossed out with deliberate force. Ink stabbed through so thoroughly the paper tore. She held the clipboard closer to the light. Beneath the torn section, barely visible, traced in fading graphite, Devonshire, Green Hollow. It was not a place she had heard mentioned in decades. Not since the inquiry. The home had been built for convalescents, a private facility in the countryside, run by a charitable trust, funded partially by the Red Cross, partially by anonymous donors, meant for injured officers and civilian patients unfit for discharge. It had held 36 beds, 14 staff, 16 confirmed survivors, until the fire, which reduced the building to stone, ash, and rumor. Miss Marple remembered it well. She had not been involved in the investigation, but she had read the telegram that followed. The woman believed responsible, Edith Lestrange, had vanished in the blaze. Or so the report claimed, but there had never been a body. Only a single item recovered from the nurses' quarters. A small brass name tag, singed and bent, found half-melted behind a drawer. Its inscription, as she remembered, read, E. Lestrange, night duty. She had filed it away, then. Another unconfirmed tragedy of war. Now it seemed less like a tragedy and more like a confession deferred. If memory was indeed a landscape, then Green Hollow was its boundary, the place where all recollection grew uncertain, where names blurred and faces changed, where silence had been signed in ink and never questioned again. But the past does not stay buried merely because the records have been misplaced. Sometimes it travels, quietly, faithfully, until the moment it is acknowledged. Or confronted. Miss Marple stood now in the quiet space between compartments, neither in one nor the other. She reached into the sleeve of her coat and retrieved the folded telegram she had taken from the dining car 2 nights before. It was not addressed. Its message short. 7 were present. 1 has vanished. The 8th watches. For the first time, she believed she knew what it meant. She returned to the sketchbook and turned to the pages not yet numbered. There she found something unexpected. An insert slipped between 2 leaves, brittle, folded, and darkened with age. It was a patient intake form. Name, Charles Dupin. Admitted, 1943. Location, Green Hollow Convalescent Home. Diagnosis, fracture, right tibia, acute psychogenic tremors. Assigned nurse, E. Lestrange. She opened the next folded sheet. A second file. Name, Veronica Grant. Date of stay, May-July 1944. Incident report attached. Signed off by Nurse E. Lestrange. She opened a third, and a fourth. Each passenger aboard the train, each one, had at some point passed through the same place. Some had received treatment. Some had worked there. Some were never meant to leave. The records should have perished in the fire. All official traces had been marked lost in incident. But now they appeared again, not in a government archive, nor a dusty box in a solicitor's office, but aboard a train that had not moved in nearly 2 days. And just then, a sound behind her, a scraping. Miss Marple turned slowly. The bench beneath the carriage window had shifted forward, only slightly, as though someone had reached behind it. She stepped closer, looked down. Wedged in the gap between seat and wall, blackened at the corners, was a piece of brass no larger than a postage stamp. She knelt, removed a glove, and gently pried it loose. The metal flaked under her touch, but the engraving remained. The name had not faded. It read, Edith Lestrange, nurse. And though the object was unmistakably real, the discovery came not with clarity, but with weight, a memory not of her own, yet one she felt she had carried for years. She rose, and just then, for the briefest moment, caught in the glass reflection of the carriage door Mrs. Lestrange, not seated, not walking, but standing, still, in a nurse's uniform, no expression, only her eyes watching. The door opened, no one on the other side, only her own reflection once more, and a question, now more pressing than ever. What if the train itself was not the vehicle, but the destination? The sketchbook fell closed beside her, and for the first time since this journey began, Miss Marple allowed herself a thought she had, until now, resisted. This may not be a mystery that wishes to be solved. Chapter 5. The Revelation. It is one thing to revisit the past through memory, quite another to be drawn into it physically, compelled to walk familiar corridors with unfamiliar certainty, to see once more the faces of those who never truly left. And as Miss Marple stood at the center of the train's silent stillness, the brass name tag resting in her palm, she no longer asked whether this was a mystery to be solved. She now asked if this was judgment. The sketchbook, when opened again, had changed, not in layout nor in artistry, but in atmosphere. The figures had lost definition. Their lines had softened, blurred, not through haste, but through time, as if each had begun to fade. Except one, Mrs. Lestrange, still clear, still watching, still wearing the uniform of her past. Miss Marple turned the page. At the top, written in an unfamiliar hand but unmistakable tone, were 3 words. This is re-entry, not return, not vengeance. Re-entry. Into what? She stepped into the corridor. The windows had gone dark, not from weather but absence. No snow, no trees, no terrain, only black glass, and in that reflection, herself, younger again, wearing a scarf she had not owned in 40 years, and standing beside her, unmistakably this time Mrs. Lestrange, smiling, not warm, not cruel, simply aware. Miss Marple entered the dining car where only one passenger remained, Mr. Dupin. He was seated in silence, his fingers gently touching the rim of a porcelain cup. "They've changed the place settings," he said, not looking up. "This wasn't the arrangement." "What was it before?" she asked. Circular. Circular. As it was at Green Hollow, in the common room, after supper, when she gave us the drink." He touched his lips, thoughtfully, then frowned. No, that was someone else. Wasn't it? But he could no longer finish the thought. Miss Marple turned away. In the small corridor behind the dining car, often used for storage, she found the box. Plain wood, lid unlatched, no key. Inside, documents, letters, a photograph. She lifted it carefully. 12 patients, standing in the garden of the Convalescent Home. Green Hollow. Among them, Mr. Dupin, the American woman, even the Hungarian gentleman who had vanished 3 days prior, and in the corner of the image, Mrs. Lestrange, standing behind them, arms crossed, no smile. But the date at the bottom of the photograph was what caused Miss Marple's hand to pause. 1946, May. The fire, according to official records, had occurred in April, a month earlier. Yet here was the proof. They had still been alive, and someone had not wanted the record to reflect it. Miss Marple opened the envelope tucked behind the photograph. It contained a diary page, ripped neatly from a leather-bound journal. It read, she said it was mercy, that the war had broken them. That peace was a false hope. The poison was measured, the results certain, but we did not all drink. Some of us remembered, some of us resisted, the rest remain unattributed, And just as Miss Marple finished reading, the carriage lights flickered once, then steadied again. On the table beside her, though she had not heard it open, the sketchbook had turned a page by itself. At the top, a new entry, not drawn, written, one word only. Poison. Poison, the sketchbook had said. Not illustrated, not speculated, declared. The words sat on the page like a sentence already passed, clean, quiet, and irreversible. Miss Marple sat still. Her thoughts no longer sought motive. They now sought pattern. Not the pattern of a single act, but of consequence. Long deferred, now gently tightening around every name, every face. She turned the page. This one had changed too. At first glance it appeared blank, but in the right light, under the slant of the carriage lamp, faint graphite impressions surfaced. A chart, a table of sorts. 3 columns, name, treatment, outcome. Most of the entries were smudged, blurred by time or deliberate wear, but a few remained. Grant, Veronica, oral solution, post-surgical, confusion, regression. Depend, Charles, small dose administered nightly, hallucinations reported. Ward, M, refused treatment. Lestrange, E, initiator. The term initiator had been circled twice in red pencil. Miss Marple closed the sketchbook slowly. She had known wartime improvisation in medicine, knew it well. Supply shortages had forced many to adjust, to experiment, to weigh suffering against ethics. But this was not improvisation. This was a pattern, and it had not ended when the war did. She moved once again through the corridor. The lights above flickered with each footstep, not from electrical fault, but rhythm, as though the train responded to her motion. At the far end, seated in the corner, was the American woman. No longer muttering, no longer folding paper, simply staring. "Do you remember Green Hollow?" Miss Marple asked. "Of course I do," she said softly, her voice too calm. "But I was told not to." "By whom?" "Nurse Lestrange," she said, forgetting was part of healing. "And yet you're here." "I never left." Her eyes met Miss Marple's for the first time. "None of us really left." Miss Marple stepped back. Her shoes made no sound against the floor. She passed Mr. Dupin next. He sat facing the window, though there was still nothing to see outside. No snow, no landscape, just a glass pane that now resembled more a mirror than a view. He spoke before she did. "They buried the story." "Which story?" "The one where we weren't patients." He turned to her now. "We were tests." "You all took it voluntarily." "Some did. Some thought they were being helped. Others didn't know at all." "And Nurse Lestrange?" "She administered. She recorded. She believed in the work." He paused. "Then someone resisted. One patient. He escaped. And she—" He trailed off. His lips moved without voice. Miss Marple leaned closer. "What happened to her?" "She vanished. The fire was sudden. Accident." "No." His eyes shifted. "She was removed." That word hung in the air, not quite murderous, but not far from it. Miss Marple felt the train slow, then stop again. Not from snow, not from destination. Only momentary stillness. The lights dimmed, and then came the sound again, the one she now associated not with footsteps, but with correction. Pages turning. She returned to her compartment. The sketchbook had reopened itself. This time the page displayed a face, her own, in charcoal, drawn without softness. Every crease, every angle precise, and beneath it, where the others had once been labeled, "Final Witness." She turned to the next page, but it had not yet been drawn. The pencil rested on the book's spine, as if waiting. There is a silence that accompanies truth, not the silence of comfort, nor the stillness of fear, but something thinner, sharper, like the pause before a match is struck. Miss Marple stood over the sketchbook, her own face now committed to the page, the label inscribed with such quiet intent. Final witness. The pencil still rested atop the page. It had not rolled. It had been placed, and the next page remained empty, inviting not a hand, but a decision. She sat. The rhythm of the train had changed again. It moved, but slowly, unnaturally, as if rolling through something not geographic but internal. A passage, not between cities, but states of mind. The compartment itself felt subtly rearranged. The lamp flickered once and stayed dim. The temperature dropped, not cold, but closer to absence. She opened the small drawer beside the bed. There were no personal effects, only a slip of paper she had not seen before. A list, a single-columned tally of passengers, but this one, unlike the manifest, contained no destinations, no seat assignments, no titles, only 3 elements beside each name: a date, a method, an outcome. She read the final entry slowly. Marple, Jane. 1945, July 13th. Witness statement suppressed. Outcome reassignment. There was no indication of who had written it. No heading. No author's mark. But it struck her not as accusation nor exoneration. Simply a record. And it brought the memory back. Green Hollow. She had never stayed there, that much was true. But she had visited once, briefly, quietly, on the request of a local matron who had grown uneasy about certain practices. The visit had been unofficial, the report given verbally, and the file misplaced. She had raised concerns, yes, but the war had ended, priorities had shifted, and the story buried. She had let it lie. She rose now and returned to the corridor. The train continued moving, but no conductor passed. No announcements sounded, and the passengers, those who remained, had changed. Their expressions no longer strained against forgetfulness, nor clung to illusion. They now bore the strange calm of those who had stopped pretending. As Miss Marple passed the dining car, she saw the American woman with her head down, whispering quietly to herself. She could not make out the words. In the observation carriage, Mr. Dupin now stared not at the glass, but at a torn page on his lap. The same torn page Miss Marple had found hours earlier. He looked up. She knew everything, he said simply. She never forgot, only waited. And this train, she asked. Not real, he said, but not unreal either. Then what? He held her gaze. Justice without trial, memory without mercy. He pointed toward the door behind her. You'll see. She turned. It had been closed before. Now it stood open. A compartment unnumbered. The walls darker, wood paneling older, cracked with age. Inside only a single chair. A table. And on it, the original nurse's logbook, bound in red cloth, marked private medical record. She stepped in, opened the cover. Inside dozens of names, all familiar. And among the pages, beneath each entry, were handwritten notes, notations of dosage, response, correction. There were no clinical codes, no signatures, only judgments. He imagined freedom. She resisted too late. He begged, and under her own name, now added freshly, observed, never interfered, omission noted. She turned back. The corridor was now empty. No footsteps, no sound, only the sketchbook once again on the table, and the pencil. This time it moved, slowly, deliberately, across the blank page. Lines forming, a shape, a face, her own, again. But this one, unlike the first, wore a different expression. It did not observe. It did not calculate. It looked back, and just before the pencil stopped, the label was etched beneath it. Last to remember. Miss Marple closed the book with care. The train would soon stop, but not, she now understood, at any known station. Not yet. Chapter 6, The Breakdown. There are nights so long they no longer belong to time, but to thought, nights that stretch, not across hours, but across memory. And on such a night, aboard the Orient Express, None of the passengers slept soundly. Not truly. Some lay in silence. Others murmured to themselves in forgotten dialects. And one, the woman with the red scarf, was heard to whisper the same 5 words again and again. "She's not done with us." And she wasn't the only one. By midnight, the entire corridor had fallen under a strange cadence. From behind the thin doors, the same phrase echoed, altered in tone but identical in form. "She's not done yet. She's not done yet. She's not." Even those who had spoken no words for days now muttered it softly in sleep. Miss Marple stood in the corridor, hands clasped, listening. Her reflection passed through each window without distortion now, as if the train no longer needed to deceive her. She returned to her compartment. The tray by the bed had changed. No teacup, no book, only a cloth-bound volume, Edith Lestrange's medical journal. The pages were brittle, discolored, but intact, and her handwriting, so neat it was almost severe, filled the margins with a strange mix of clinical detachment and philosophical rumination. One passage stood out. "If guilt can bind us to the living, how long must the dead ride?" Another, "They came to me not for healing, but for forgetting, and I obliged, first with words, then with tincture, then with silence." And then, in darker ink, "They asked for mercy. When it came, they called it murderous." The handwriting faltered here. She turned the next page and gasped softly. It was not writing. It was a drawing, crude but recognizable. A hallway engulfed in smoke. Figures fleeing, some helping, some trampling others, and one at the center, a woman in a nurse's uniform, reaching toward a locked door. Fire scorched the frame. On the next page, written in hurried, almost angry strokes, it was not the injections, it was the betrayal that burned louder than the flames. And with that, the air in the compartment changed. Not colder, more aware. From the corner of her eye, Miss Marple thought she saw movement in the corridor once again. She turned, and for the briefest moment, a figure, charred at the edges, uniform half-burned, standing with eyes wide and mouth sewn shut with black thread. He looked directly at her, then turned and walked slowly out of sight. She followed. No footsteps, no sound, only the occasional flutter of candlelight, now flickering from sconces she had never noticed before. Gaslight, faint and yellow. At the dining car, no one remained seated. The doors had been left open, as though the occupants had fled mid-meal. Only one seat remained occupied. A mirror, propped awkwardly in the center of the table, faced a single empty chair. And beneath the chair, a tray, morphine ampoules, still sealed. She picked one up, unlabeled, untouched, unused. But it was not the drug that disturbed her. It was the object tucked underneath it. A flash of fabric, an armband, medical, with a single embroidered name, Lestrange, and just above it, a tag, torn at the edge, burned at the bottom. She lifted it carefully and read aloud, "Edith Lestrange, nurse, Green Hollow Convalescent Home." She didn't speak. She couldn't. The train gave a shudder, not of motion, but recollection. And Miss Marple understood, with sudden and brutal clarity, that the crime had not ended with poisonings, nor with fire. The true crime had followed it, a silence, a pact, a decision by those now seated comfortably aboard to say nothing, to remember nothing, to live well, and forget thoroughly. She stepped back. The mirror on the table reflected her clearly, but she was no longer in her traveling clothes. She now wore the starched white uniform of a wartime nurse. Gloves, watch pinned neatly to the breast, and in her hands, a tray of morphine. The uniform fit too well. The watch upon her breast ticked with unnerving accuracy, its rhythm matching not her own heartbeat, but the pulse of the train itself. Miss Marple looked again at her reflection, then at the tray of morphine ampoules, 7 in total, untouched, unsullied, but arranged with precision, as if awaiting allocation. She sat, not because she wished to, but because something within her knew she had sat there once before, or would. And the mirror, still perched unnaturally on the dining table, flickered once, then dimmed. Not dark, not gone, altered. The image it reflected no longer matched the room behind her. It showed the same carriage, but scorched, dimmed by smoke, screams distant, dull as though underwater. And it was then that the past ceased to wait. She heard the voice first, not hers, but familiar. A man's. "We can't let her talk." And another, higher-pitched, breathless. "She kept records. Pages. Names. It'll destroy everything." The mirror flashed again. A vision. 7 figures, all aboard this very train, but younger, angrier, wounded not by war, but by what followed. Civilians, former soldiers, the abandoned and institutionalized, all gathered in the staff quarters of Green Hollow, circled around one door. Behind it, Edith Lestrange. They argued. They drank. And finally, one woman threw the lantern, not at the nurse, but at the wall. The oil spread. Flames climbed fast. And they stood there watching, not with rage, not even with hatred, but something far colder. Decision. The door remained locked. The screams came, and they stayed, until silence. And later, at the inquiry, each denied recollection. They had been sedated, confused. One claimed blackout. Another claimed trauma. Only one ever told the truth. Miss Marple remembered the name. Harold Finch. The same Harold who now sat in compartment 12A, smiling endlessly at no one. He had confessed, but only to her. Quietly. Years ago. A whispered confession written in a telegram she never delivered. The mirror flashed again, and now it showed her own face, but aged not by time, by guilt. The nurse's uniform flickered, faded, returned, then changed again. Miss Marple stood and crossed the dining car. The corridor, now lengthened unnaturally, echoed with every step she took. The air thickened, not from smoke, but from memory. And from behind the compartments, doors began to open, not with force, but resignation. Each occupant emerged, one by one. The American widow, the silent Hungarian gentleman, the German twins, the French artist, and Harold Finch. They gathered, not by invitation, but recognition. Each carried an object. Each had something from that night. The widow held a page from the patient ledger. The Hungarian gripped a belt once used to restrain a patient. The artist clutched the charred handle of a lantern. And Harold carried only a key, small brass cold. Miss Marple faced them. No accusations passed between them, only eyes, some wet, some ashamed, some utterly vacant, and then one voice. We let it burn. Not loud, but final. No one corrected him. No one argued. And as if summoned by that single sentence, the train itself shuddered, not violently, but with the weight of admission. Miss Marple turned the key in her mind. It had once opened that door, the one they had locked, and now it might open something else. But before she could ask, the conductor appeared, standing at the far end of the corridor, face still scorched, mouth still sewn, but in his hand a paper, folded. He extended it toward her. Miss Marple walked slowly, deliberately, and accepted it. A page from Edith Lestrange's diary. It read, "They chose silence. I offered mercy. They gave me fire. Now they will remember, one by one." On the back, a single line underlined. "The last among them is the only one who knew and did nothing." The ink was fresh, and beneath it, as if by invisible hand, another line appeared before her eyes. She must choose, administer or confess. Miss Marple turned the page again, blank, and then the tray in her hand grew heavier. The ampoules glistened. 7 glass eyes. Only one choice left. Miss Marple did not speak. The tray in her hands grew colder, though the glass ampoules beneath her fingertips seemed warmer by contrast, as though stirred from long dormancy. Across from her, the passengers had ceased to be strangers. They now stood not as innocent travelers, but as reflections, mirrors of a single night none dared name. Their faces bore no denial, only the weariness of those who had spent decades tucking truth beneath polished words, Sunday gloves, and polite society functions. But truth, when left untended, does not fade. It ripens, and then ferments. Miss Marple's gaze fell to Harold Finch, his key, the last object unspoken for, and as though moved by a force neither social nor spiritual, he stepped forward, placed it in her hand, and whispered, not with regret, but something far stranger. She was kind until she wasn't, and we didn't help. It was not a confession. It was an invitation. The conductor, still watching, still silent, faded backward, merging once again with shadow. No footfalls, no resistance. The lights dimmed, not extinguished, but subdued. Enough to see, but not clearly. And in this newly softened world, time fractured. A flash, not of light, but memory. Miss Marple standing, years ago, at the gates of Green Hollow. A younger Edith Lestrange had been speaking with her. They had tea. They had laughed. And then, another flash. That same day, an envelope slid into Miss Marple's handbag. Sealed. Stamped. A confession. Harold Finch's own hand. She had promised to deliver it to the War Office. She never did. Not from malice. From certainty. She believed the letter exaggerated. She had trusted the nurse. She believed some fates, especially in wartime, were best left unrecorded. And so she let it sit. Years passed. The envelope yellowed. Its seal cracked, and its contents were never read. Until now. Because now, every silence had found its echo. She looked down. The tray remained. 7 ampoules. 7 passengers. 7 truths. And the mirror at the end of the corridor, now larger than before, reflected only one figure. Not Miss Marple, not Edith, but someone both. Her hands no longer trembled, for the moment of choice required not nerves, but memory. And so she did not choose the ampoules. She chose the diary. She opened it once more and spoke, softly, for only the walls to hear. It was not guilt. It was fear, and we dressed it in justice. The walls did not reply, but the passengers began to move. First one, then another. Each turned toward their compartment. No panic, no argument, only movement, like actors leaving a stage they no longer remembered entering. Doors clicked shut, one by one, and only Miss Marple remained in the corridor. The mirror, still watching, now showed her reflection again, but she no longer wore the uniform. She wore her own clothes. The nurse was gone, but not erased. Under the collar of her blouse, tucked discreetly, was the charred name tag, a memory, or a warning. And just as she began to turn, toward the rear of the carriage, toward whatever would come next, the sketchbook slid from the wall compartment and fell open at her feet. Its final page, once blank, now showed her face, fully rendered, precisely drawn, and standing behind her, a hand, not touching, but present, reaching, frozen in place, with one final phrase scrawled beneath the image. The final hour remembers all. The train gave a single lurch forward, and the compartment lights flickered back to full. Morning had come, or something that wore its shape. And now, dear listener, if you've stayed with us this far, you've likely sensed the shift. This is not merely a tale of deception or guilt, but memory itself. Do you believe guilt fades, or does it travel with us? If you've found this mystery worthy of your attention, consider joining us again by subscribing. More shadows await, but only the observant will see them. Chapter 7. The Judgment. The train had not moved, not an inch, And yet Miss Marple was certain they were no longer on any map she'd ever known. The faint gold light pouring through the windows was too even, too hollow, lacking all source. It was not dawn nor dusk. It was a waiting room without time. She stepped into the dining car. No conversation, no clinking china, only stillness, and the heavy presence of breath held far too long. The passengers were already seated, as though summoned by a hand not physical but remembered. Each faced forward. None turned to greet her. At the head of the carriage, where the steward usually announced meal times or port arrival, stood a figure, fully visible, not flickering, not glimpsed, Mrs. Lestrange. Her posture bore the elegance of old photographs, a formality no longer taught, and a grace untethered from charm. She stood not as ghost or guest, but as hostess, and in her left hand she held the sketchbook. Miss Marple stepped forward. Each step drew a whisper. From the passengers, uncoordinated, breathy, and yet uncannily in unison. "She's not done yet." Mrs. Lestrange's eyes did not blink. She scanned the table as if inspecting a guest list. Her mouth moved slowly, each word chosen as though pulled from deep soil. "You have all had your stories," she said calmly. "Now I will hear mine." She turned to the first passenger, an elderly woman, powdered, gloved, hiding trembling fingers. "Margaret Adley, you were my patient. You asked for more morphine than permitted, and when denied you wrote a letter and posted it to my superior." Margaret whimpered. "I never meant for them to take your license." Mrs. Lestrange gave no reply. She extended a hand. Margaret vanished, not violently, simply gone. Her teacup clinked lightly against the saucer. The next man trembled before she even turned to him. "Harold Finch," she intoned. He looked down, as if rehearsing an apology that could unmake the past. "You forged documents. You buried reports. You said you were saving us from headlines." Harold nodded, the motion small. "I was told to contain scandal." A silence passed. He remained, but the shadows beneath his seat grew longer, as if absorbing him slowly. Another woman sobbed. "I never knew," she whispered. "I was only told she had transferred." Mrs. Lestrange did not challenge this. "And yet you did not ask." One by one she faced them. Some disappeared, others wept, and a few remained, but bent slightly more with each syllable, as though the weight of recollection pressed downward without mercy. Miss Marple stood apart. Mrs. Lestrange finally faced her. "You weren't part of it, but you see them, don't you? You always have." The room exhaled, not sound, presence. Miss Marple calmly met her gaze. "Yes," she said, "and I always will." With that utterance, the golden haze in the windows dimmed slightly, not with shadow, but with the quiet realization that some truths once acknowledged cling. Mrs. Lestrange did not move, nor did she speak again. Yet the very air around her bent, perceptibly, as if reluctant to stay so near. Her form remained, but her scrutiny passed on, back toward the passengers. To the gentleman with the watch chain and the vacant eyes. To the young woman with ink-stained gloves and a constant, fixed smile. To the twin brothers whose memories failed in precisely the same places. Their answers did not come in words, but in reactions. Stiffened posture, tremors of the jaw, hands grasping at imagined lapels. There was no need for spoken confessions. This was not a trial. It was a reckoning by recognition alone. The weight of omission was sufficient. Then the sketchbook trembled, unaided. No wind, no hand. It opened of its own accord, slowly turning pages as if sorting names from memory. A blank sheet stopped, and Miss Marple observed lines forming, faint at first, then unmistakable. A profile, masculine, familiar, the conductor who had vanished, but now not in uniform. No cap, a young man in patient garb. Below the sketch, a name, Elias Hart. She remembered it faintly from the scribbled margin back in her compartment. He had existed. She had proof. Yet, why had none acknowledged his presence? Perhaps he, too, had watched the train go still. Perhaps he had been the first to recognize what this journey truly was. The golden light now flickered, not erratically, but like a failing memory. And Lestrange turned the final page. Blank. Then strokes began. The face forming was not from recollection, nor from guilt. It was drawn in real time. Miss Marple, and behind her an indistinct figure, just out of focus. No eyes, no expression, just the unmistakable suggestion of presence. A single word appeared beneath the drawing. Witness. The sketchbook remained open, pages unmoving now, as though the weight of that single image had frozen its breath. The passengers began to murmur, not in fear but in remembrance. The whispering phrase returned, repeated not in panic, but with the resigned cadence of something finally accepted. She's not done yet. Mrs. Lestrange raised her eyes one last time, scanning the remaining faces. Some nodded solemnly. Others looked away. Then, slowly, with the same deliberate grace with which she had first arrived, she closed the book, not with force, but with finality. A gesture that did not end something, but sealed it. Outside, the golden haze lightened, giving way not to morning, but to clarity. The train still did not move. Yet the silence within shifted, no longer the stillness of paralysis, but the pause of an inhalation before speaking. Miss Marple turned from the sketchbook to the now vacated seat where Lestrange had stood. Only the faintest trace remained, the scent of ink, the echo of a gaze that had weighed each soul and found them wanting or worthy. She looked once more at her own face upon the page, still there, still being watched, and then she noticed the indistinct figure behind her had shifted. Closer. She did not look back. Instead, she reached for her gloves, smoothed her coat, and stepped once more into the corridor. The train had not moved, but the journey had changed. And for those who remained, so had the destination. Chapter 8. The Return. The air had shifted, subtly, like a curtain drawn in a room one had forgotten was lit. Miss Marple did not feel herself disembark, so much as awaken into stillness. Her foot met the platform without sound, her cane tapping softly beside her, though not echoing, as though even space had tired of conversation. The Orient Express had stopped, yet no porter came to greet, no call of arrival, no clatter of movement. A fog, not cold, but quiet, hung in pale ribbons above the ground. Lamps cast light, but not warmth, and benches lay undisturbed beneath their glow, untouched by the weight of waiting bodies. She moved forward, passing an unmanned kiosk, its stand holding one folded newspaper. The ink had aged, browned, and softened, but the headlines struck with brutal clarity. Devonshire Convalescent Home tragedy. 12 dead in mysterious fire. Miss Marple read it not once, but twice. Her gaze traced each line with the precision of habit, but her mind had long since leapt ahead. The photograph, half-collapsed walls, charred beams. The text beneath it whispered more than it printed. Her eyes stopped at one line. One staff member unaccounted for. Identity presumed lost in misidentification. She inhaled slowly. Not lost. She was beginning to suspect deliberately misplaced. There, across the platform, beyond the ghost light and stillness, a second train stood. Its exterior gleamed, not from polish, but absence of wear as if untouched by time. The door hung open, and from the misted edge, a figure stepped forward. She wore gloves. Her coat was elegant, her face younger. Edith Lestrange. No shadows in her eyes now. No sketchbook clutched in terror. Only confidence, and something that looked disturbingly like peace. She smiled, and with graceful steps, she boarded that train. The door shut behind her not with finality, but invitation. Miss Marple did not follow. She turned instead, back toward the carriage she had exited, its doors now all closed save one. She returned, drawn by instinct more than resolve. Carriage 3. Her seat. Her space. The sketchbook lay there, open, waiting, not left behind but placed. The final page was blank, or it had been. Before her eyes, without hand or tool, the page darkened. A mark, then another. Charcoal formed the curve of a cheek, the suggestion of an eye, a nose, then lips. Slowly, deliberately, until a new face emerged. Unfamiliar, unnamed, not hers, not anyone still aboard. Someone yet to come, because the journey was not over, not for the train, not for the ledger it kept. She turned to the empty platform, and with quiet certainty, her voice carried forward. Some crimes ride in circles, waiting for someone to watch them end. The page in the sketchbook stilled, and the train did not depart. It waited. Thank you for traveling with us. If you remained until now, then perhaps you, too, have seen the signs. For stories drawn in charcoal and guilt, we invite you to return. Subscribe, there are more shadows to trace. Miss Marple will return.